The humid air of the Jiangsu province hung heavy over the Sichuan airfield, a thick, stagnant veil that seemed to stifle the very breath of the men stationed there. It was a Tuesday in mid-January in the year 1945, a time when the sun felt more like a distant, pale observer than a source of warmth. To the men of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service, the war had begun to feel like a slow, inevitable tide receding from a jagged shore. Major Yasuhiko Kuroe stood by the edge of the dirt runway, his boots caked in the yellow dust of the Chinese plains. He was a man who lived by the tachometer and the compass, a veteran of countless dogfights who could tell the health of an engine by the subtle vibration in his rudder pedals. Beside him, a group of young technicians stood in silence, their faces etched with a mixture of exhaustion and a quiet, simmering melancholy. Then, the sound arrived. It was not the frantic, high-pitched scream of a Nakajima Sakai engine, nor the guttural roar of a Mitsubishi. It was a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of their bones, a mechanical heartbeat so rhythmic and powerful it commanded the air itself. From the low-hanging clouds to the west, a shape materialized. It was larger than any fighter Kuroe had ever seen. Even from a distance, the polished aluminum skin caught the dying light of the afternoon, gleaming with a predatory silver luster that made the drab, dark green Oscars and Tojos on the field look like relics of a forgotten era. The aircraft moved with a terrifying grace, its wide-bladed propeller carving through the atmosphere with effortless authority. "A Mustang," whispered one of the technicians, his voice trembling with a realization that bordered on religious awe. The American fighter did not circle aggressively. It glided toward the runway with its landing gear extended, three massive wheels reaching down like the talons of a hawk. The pilot, Second Lieutenant Thomas Whitehead of the United States Army Air Forces, had lost his way in the blinding fog of the inland mountains. Low on fuel and betrayed by his instruments, he had mistaken the Japanese markings for those of his Chinese allies. As the heavy fighter touched down, the weight of the machine was palpable. 7 tons of steel, aluminum, and high-octane fuel slammed into the earth, sending a cloud of dust billowing into the air. The struts hissed as they compressed, absorbing the impact with a mechanical sophistication that made the Japanese onlookers flinch. The engine gave one final, defiant bark before the 4-bladed propeller slowed to a rhythmic clatter and then stopped. Silence returned to Sichuan, but it was a different kind of silence. A heavy, suffocating quiet. Kuroe walked toward the machine. Up close, the P-51D was immense. The wings were thick at the root, featuring a strange, smooth profile that seemed to defy the traditional laws of aerodynamics. There were no visible rivets, no jagged seams. The fuselage was a continuous, flowing sculpture of metal. He climbed onto the wing, his hand brushing against the cold, smooth duralumin. Under his palm, he felt the latent heat of a journey spanning hundreds of miles. He looked into the bubble canopy, a single, seamless piece of plexiglass that offered the pilot a godlike view of the world. Inside, the cockpit was not a cramped, oily cage like those Kuroe was used to. It was an orderly, logical expanse of switches, dials, and luminous gauges, all labeled in crisp, white English lettering. The American pilot, pale and wide-eyed with the realization of his fatal error, was led away by guards. But Kuroe did not look at the man. His eyes were fixed on the machine. He saw the 6 Browning machine gun ports protruding from the wings, their muzzles dark and expectant. He saw the massive radiators scoop under the belly, designed to cool a heart of 12 cylinders that could outrun the wind. In that moment, a profound sense of spiritual unease washed over him. This was not just a weapon of war. This was a message from a future that Japan could no longer reach. A product of a civilization that measured victory in horsepower and thousands of hours of wind tunnel testing. Kuroe reached out and touched the emblem painted on the nose. A galloping horse, wild and untamed. He realized then that the Empire had not just captured a plane. They had captured a demon that they did not yet know how to exhume. The dust had barely settled before a perimeter of armed guards, their bayonets gleaming with a dull, oil-rubbed finish, encircled the silver apparition. Major Kuroe remained atop the wing, his presence a silent command that kept the frantic chatter of the ground crews at a distance. He was not looking for a flaw, he was looking for a soul. He knelt, his gloved fingers tracing the seam where the ammunition bay doors met the wing's surface. In Japanese construction, such joints often bore the tiny, telltale marks of a hammer or the slight irregularity of hand-filed duralumin. Here, there was only a microscopic, uniform gap, as if the metal had been grown in a laboratory rather than forged in a factory. "Captain Ishida," Kuroe called out, his voice cutting through the humid air. A lean man with spectacles thick as bottle glass stepped forward, clutching a clipboard as if it were a shield. Ishida was the lead maintenance officer, a man who had spent 3 years trying to keep the temperamental engines of the Empire running on diluted oil and prayers. "Open the engine cowling," Kuroe commanded, "and fetch the translator. I want every placard in that cockpit rendered into Japanese by nightfall." As the technicians labored with their screwdrivers, Kuroe finally stepped into the cockpit. The transition was jarring. To sit in a Nakajima fighter was to be part of a minimalist, fragile bird. You felt every vibration, every gust of wind through the thin fabric and light metal. But the Mustang felt like a fortress. The seat was armored with a heavy plate of high-carbon steel that covered the pilot's back and head, a luxury the Japanese High Command deemed an insult to the spirit of Bushido. The smell hit him next. It wasn't the scorched castor oil and stale sweat of a Japanese cockpit. It was the scent of industrial abundance. Rich, sweet hydraulic fluid, fresh lacquer, and the ozone of high-quality electrical insulation. He gripped the control stick. It moved with a fluid, ball-bearing precision that made his own aircraft feel like a collection of rusted hinges. On the left console, he found the throttle quadrant. It was a masterpiece of ergonomics, with a large, comfortable grip that housed the microphone button and the lead computing gunsight controls. "Major, look at this!" Ishida's voice broke from outside, cracking with a sudden, sharp anxiety. Kuroe climbed back out and walked to the nose. The cowling had been removed, revealing the Packard-built V1657 Merlin engine. It lay there like a sleeping predator, a tangled but perfectly organized labyrinth of coolant lines, spark plug wires, and the massive housing of the 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger. Ishida pointed to a small brass plate riveted to the engine block. "It is not just the engine, Major," Ishida whispered, his face pale. "Look at the casting of the block. There are no pits, no bubbles. Even the cooling fins are polished. And the spark plugs. They are shielded against radio interference. We struggle to produce 10 engines a month that don't leak oil from the seals. The Americans, they are building thousands of these." Kuroe peered deeper into the airframe. He saw the self-sealing fuel tanks, thick layers of natural rubber designed to swallow incendiary bullets. He saw the radio equipment, compact, modular, and shielded in black crackle boxes that looked more like laboratory instruments than field gear. He realized then that the terror of the P-51 was not merely in its speed or its guns. It was in the fact that it was built for a human being. The Americans did not expect their pilots to be disposable gods. They expected them to be technicians of destruction, supported by a machine that guarded their lives with every valve and wire. "Major," Ishida said, his voice dropping to a low, mournful tone, "the fuel we drain from the tanks, it is 100 octane, clear as spring water. Our best refineries in Sumatra can barely produce 92 on their finest day." Kuroe looked up at the darkening sky. To the east, the Pacific stretched out, a vast graveyard where the remnants of the Imperial Navy lay in silence. He thought of the young boys in the flight schools, barely 20 years old, being rushed to the front in Hayabusa fighters that were little more than silk and splinters. "We will fly it," Kuroe said, his voice cold and resolute, masking the hollow ache in his chest. "We will take it to the research institute at Fussa. We will find a way to kill it, or we will learn why it is killing us. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the silver Mustang seemed to glow with an inner light, a silent, metallic witness to the twilight of an empire. The ferry flight from Suzhou to the Japanese archipelago was the strangest ordeal of Major Kuroe's long career. Sitting in the cockpit of the Mustang, he felt less like a pilot and more like an explorer who had harnessed a comet. On either side of him, keeping a respectful distance, flew two P-43 escort fighters. Previously, these nimble machines had represented the pinnacle of grace to Kuroe, but now, peering at their fabric-covered wings through the flawless plexiglass of the American canopy, they looked like fragile toys from a forgotten century. 2,000 miles separated the Chinese airfield from the Fussa Flight Test Center. For any Japanese fighter, such a journey would have been a grueling marathon, requiring multiple refueling stops. The Mustang, however, seemed not to notice the distance. Kuroe glanced at the fuel gauge. The needle had barely moved despite the hundreds of miles already conquered. "Incredible," he whispered, his voice devoid of its usual tension, swallowed by the steady, confident thrum of the 12 cylinders. At an altitude of 15,000 feet, the air was freezing, but inside the cockpit, it was as warm as a spring day. The American engineers had provided a heating system that Japanese pilots, accustomed to shivering in heavy, sheepskin-lined flight suits, could only dream of. Kuroe felt almost guilty for this comfort. In a world where war was the ultimate expression of asceticism and self-sacrifice, this aircraft offered something else, efficiency born of ergonomics. Below the wing, the gray swells of the East China Sea slipped by. Kuroe cautiously nudged the throttle forward. The engine responded instantly, without the coughing or soot-black smoke common to Japanese power plants. The increase in speed was terrifying. The speedometer needle, marked in miles per hour, swept to the right with an ease that suggested the laws of aerodynamic drag had ceased to exist for this silver cigar. The escort pilots began to fall behind. Kuroe watched in the rearview mirror, another detail often ignored by the Japanese to save weight, as the Oscars began to struggle, their propellers churning the air desperately to keep pace. To avoid abandoning his own men, Kuroe was forced to drop his flaps by several degrees, artificially shackling the stride of the steel demon. In that moment, a profound melancholy took hold of him. He understood that this flight was not merely the transportation of a trophy, it was a funeral procession for the Empire's aviation. If one machine could possess such mastery over space and time, what could thousands of them do? As the silhouette of the sacred Mount Fuji appeared on the horizon, its snow-capped peak glinting in the rays of the setting sun, Kuroe looked at it through the reticle of the K-14 computing gun sight. This sight was a mechanical brain. It calculated lead and distance automatically. The Major imagined a Japanese silhouette falling into those crosshair. He did not need to be a prophet to know that his countrymen would stand no chance. As he approached Fussa, the airfield fell silent. News of the Silver Ghost had spread across the region. Hundreds of technicians, officers, and cadets spilled onto the runway, necks craned toward the sky. Kuroe performed one final low-level pass. The whistle of the air sliced by the laminar flow wings sounded like the howl of a banshee. He flared the heavy machine gently, the tires kissing the concrete with a soft chirp. When the massive four-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller made its final revolution and stopped, Kuroe did not open the canopy for a long time. He sat in the silence, listening to the metal cool, a rhythmic ticking like a clock counting down the final hours of his nation. The doors of Hangar No. 3 at the Fussa Flight Test Center were sealed with a finality that suggested a tomb. Yet inside, the atmosphere was one of frantic, surgical precision. The Mustang stood at the center of the concrete floor, its silver skin stripped away in sections to reveal a skeletal architecture that left the Imperial Army's finest aeronautical engineers in a state of stunned silence. Professor Okada, the man responsible for the Empire's struggling liquid-cooled engine programs, stood upon a wooden scaffold. His hands, stained with the honey-colored American oil that smelled of high-grade chemicals rather than the scorched castor oil of Japan, trembled as he peered into the labyrinth of the Packard Merlin V-1657. Look at these spark plugs, Okada whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of professional admiration and patriotic despair. Each one is shielded against radio interference. We struggle to find enough copper for our radios, yet the Americans wrap every wire in a protective sheath just so their pilots can hear a clear signal from halfway across the Pacific. He climbed down and gestured toward the massive radiator housing slung beneath the aircraft's belly. "It is not merely a cooling system, Major Kuro," he said, turning to the pilot. "It is a thermodynamic masterwork. It utilizes the Meredith effect. The air entering the radiator is heated and then expelled at a higher velocity, actually creating a small amount of jet thrust. This machine does not fight the air, it consumes it. It turns drag into propulsion." Nearby, a team of weapon technicians had removed one of the 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns. They had laid the ammunition belts across a white linen cloth. Each round was a gleaming masterpiece of brass and lead, uniform to the thousandth of an inch. 2,800 rounds, noted the lead armorer, shaking his head. And every 5th round is an armor-piercing incendiary. One burst from this Mustang would not just damage a Japanese fighter, it would turn it into a funeral pyre. Our Type 99 cannons are slow and prone to jamming. These are sewing machines of death. They will fire until the barrels melt, and they will not miss a beat. Kuro walked to the tail section, where a technician was examining the radio equipment. It was a modular system, encased in black crackle boxes that looked more like laboratory instruments than field gear. "They have a remote-controlled VHF set, Major," the technician reported, his eyes wide behind thick spectacles. "The pilot can switch frequencies with a flick of a thumb. While our pilots are lucky if they can hear a garbled command through the static of a hand-wound coil, the Americans are talking to one another, to their bombers, and to their bases 1,000 miles away as if they were sitting in the same room." The realization was beginning to settle over the hangar like a cold fog. It was the shock of mathematical and industrial reality. This aircraft was not the product of a desperate nation clinging to ancient traditions. It was the apex of a civilization that had mastered the assembly line, the supercharger, and the physics of high-altitude war. "Major," Professor Okada said, leaning heavily against the scaffold, "we can copy the lines of this wing. We can perhaps even mimic the radiator. But we cannot copy the country that built it. We do not have the steel. We do not have the fuel. And most of all, we do not have the time." Kuroe looked at the Mustang's nose, where the painted stallion seemed to mock them with its frozen gallop. He felt a deep, hollow melancholy, a realization that the age of the lone samurai, the age of the sword and the spirit, had been crushed by the weight of 12,000 horsepower and the relentless precision of a distant factory. The morning of the test was cold, the air over Fussa as clear and brittle as a sheet of glass. On the tarmac, 2 aircraft stood side by side, representing the absolute zenith of their respective nations. To the left was the Ki-84 Hayate, known to the Americans as Frank. It was the pride of the Imperial Army, a lean, lethal machine built for the frantic, twisting dogfights of the Pacific. To the right stood the captured P-51-D Mustang, its polished silver skin reflecting the sunrise like a mirror. Major Kuroe climbed into the Mustang's cockpit. He felt a strange, traitorous thrill as the Merlin engine roared to life with its characteristic rhythmic whistle. Across from him, the Empire's top ace, Captain Shimada, gave a sharp nod from the cockpit of his Hayate. Shimada believed in the superior maneuverability of Japanese engineering. He believed that the spirit of the pilot could overcome any mechanical advantage. The takeoff was a revelation. While the Hayate clawed at the air, its engine straining to lift its weight, the Mustang surged forward. Kuroe felt the immense torque of the 4-bladed propeller pulling him into the seat. By the time they reached 10,000 feet, the Mustang was already circling, waiting for the Japanese fighter to catch up. "Begin the engagement," the radio crackled from the tower. Shimada moved first. With the grace of a predatory bird, he pulled the Hayate into a tight, climbing turn, attempting to get behind the American fighter. In a traditional Japanese dogfight, this would have been the end. But Kuroe did not follow the old rules. He nudged the throttle into the war emergency power notch. The Mustang didn't just turn, it accelerated in the vertical. Kuroe pulled the stick back, and the silver fighter surged upward like a rocket, leaving the Hayate floundering in the thinner air below. From his bubble canopy, Kuroe looked down. He could see Shimada's plane clearly, a dark green speck struggling to maintain its lift. The Mustang's two-stage supercharger was now doing what no Japanese engine could. It was breathing deeply in the cold, rare atmosphere, providing full power where the Hayate began to choke. Kuroe rolled the Mustang onto its back and dived. The speed built with terrifying rapidity: 400, 450, 500 miles per hour. The controls remained light and responsive thanks to the precision-balanced ailerons. In a Japanese plane, the stick would have become heavy and sluggish at such speeds, but the Mustang handled like a dream. He swept past Shimada's wing with a thunderous roar. Had his guns been loaded, the Hayate would have been disintegrated in a single 2-second burst of 650 caliber machine guns. Kuroe pulled up again, using his immense kinetic energy to regain his altitude. He realized then the fundamental difference. The Hayate was a sword, designed for a duel of honor. The Mustang was a scalpel, designed for a surgery of annihilation. Shimada tried every trick in the book. He performed tight loops, side slips, and sudden brakes. But Kuroe simply refused to play his game. He stayed high, diving only when he had the advantage, then zooming back into the safety of the clouds. It was a cold, mathematical dominance. As the two planes descended back toward Fussa, Kuroe looked at his gauges. The engine temperature was perfect. The fuel was still plentiful. He looked at the Hayate landing ahead of him, its engine spitting blue smoke, its pilot exhausted from the physical strain of the fight. The Major felt a cold shiver of realization. The Americans hadn't just built a better plane. They had changed the very nature of war. They had removed the warrior from the equation and replaced him with an operator of a superior system. The silence in the briefing room at Fussa was thicker than the mountain mist clinging to the pines outside. 10 of Japan's most decorated pilots, men who had survived the hell of Midway, the attrition of Rabaul, and the swirling dogfights over the Philippines, sat on low wooden benches. Their flight suits were stained with grease and salt, their faces etched with the hollow, weary look of hunters who had become the hunted. At the front of the room stood Major Kuroe. He had not yet removed his leather flight helmet, the straps hanging loose like the jowls of a tired hound. Behind him, a chalkboard was covered in hastily scrawled figures: airspeeds, climb rates, and wing loading coefficients. "Captain Shimada," Kuroe began, his voice rasping from the dry oxygen of the high-altitude flight. "Tell them." Shimada stood slowly. He was a man who had claimed 27 victories in the Hayate, a pilot who believed that a Japanese soul was worth more than 1,000 horsepower. But today, his hands were shoved deep into his pockets to hide their trembling. "I could not touch him," Shimada said, his voice barely a whisper. "Every time I initiated a turn, every time I thought I had the angle for a deflection shot, the Mustang simply vanished. It did not dance with me. It did not honor the circle. It climbed away at a speed that made my engine sound like a dying ox." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the room. A veteran pilot from the 11th Air Fleet stood up, his brow furrowed. "But the Hayate is faster than the Hellcat and more nimble than the Corsair. How can a single-engine plane from a base 700 miles away dominate our best interceptor over our own soil?" Kuroe stepped forward, tapping a piece of chalk against the board with rhythmic, bone-chilling precision. "Because, Lieutenant, we are fighting a war of the 19th century against a foe from the 21st, Kuroe said. "The Americans have solved the problem of distance. They have solved the problem of altitude. While we were perfecting the art of the turn, they were perfecting the science of the energy. The P-51 does not need to outturn you. It simply dictates when, where, and how you will die." He turned to the chalkboard and drew 2 intersecting lines, one steep and straight, the other a jagged, struggling curve. "This is the Mustang's power curve," Kuroe explained. "At 30,000 feet, where the air is too thin for our lungs and our engines, the American is at his most lethal. His supercharger, a mechanical lung of incredible complexity, feeds his engine a constant stream of compressed air. He sits in a heated cabin, breathing pure oxygen, watching us through a stabilized gun sight that does the mathematics of slaughter for him." Kuroe paused, looking at the row of young cadets in the back, boys who would be sent up in Akinos and Oscars next week to face a swarm of these silver demons. "And then there is the matter of the Browning machine guns," Kuroe continued, his tone turning clinical and cold. 6 guns, 1,800 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. I inspected the target sleeve after our mock engagement. It was not merely hit, it was shredded. The American pilot does not need a lucky shot to the fuel tank. He simply points his nose in your general direction and unleashes a wall of lead that disintegrates aluminum and bone alike. Professor Okada, who had been sitting in the shadows of the corner, spoke up. "It is the mathematics of industrial supremacy. They are building these machines at a rate of 1 every hour. They are refined, consistent, and terrifyingly reliable. We are building our engines in underground caves, using slave labor and inferior alloys. For every Mustang we shoot down, 10 more leave the assembly lines in California." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, a collective realization of spiritual and material bankruptcy. "My verdict is this," Kuroe said, leaning over the table, his eyes burning with a dark, melancholic light. "The Mustang is not a plane. It is a message. It tells us that the sky no longer belongs to the brave. It belongs to the engineers, the factories, and the oil wells. We are no longer fighting men. We are fighting an avalanche of steel." Shimada looked up, his eyes glassy. "Then what is left for us, Major? If our skill and our spirit mean nothing against their machines?" Kuroe reached for his gloves, his movements slow and deliberate. "Only the end, Captain. We will fly until the fuel runs out, or until the silver wings blot out the sun. We will fight because we are Japanese, but let no man in this room lie to himself. We are already ghosts. The Mustang has already won the war. The rest is merely the counting of the dead." As the pilots filed out of the room, none of them looked at the silver fighter parked on the apron outside. It sat there in the moonlight, cold and indifferent, a silent sentinel marking the end of an era. The captured P-51D sat in the center of hangar number 3, no longer a mere machine, but a psychological contagion. The technical manuals had been translated, the engine had been dissected, and the mock dogfights had been concluded. But as the month of April in the year 1945 progressed, the Mustang began to haunt the base in a way that no Broken Zero or captured B-29 ever could. It was the silence that was most unsettling. The Japanese mechanics, men who had spent their lives coaxing temperamental engines to life with hand cranks and improvised tools, now stood in small, hushed groups around the silver fighter. They watched it with a mixture of reverence and a deep, gnawing melancholy. "It does not leak," one young technician whispered, pointing to the spotless concrete beneath the Packard Merlin engine. "We have run it for 10 hours of testing, and there is not a single drop of oil. Our Nakajima engines leave a puddle after 10 minutes." The lack of mechanical failure was, to them, a form of technological arrogance. It suggested a world where entropy itself had been defeated by the American assembly line. Major Kuroe, walking through the hangar in the late evening, felt the morale of the base fracturing. It wasn't just the mechanics, it was the veteran pilots. They no longer talked about Bushido or the divine wind. Instead, they spent their hours in the ready room studying the Mustang's technical charts with the grim intensity of men reading their own death warrants. One night, Kuroe found Captain Shimada sitting alone on the wing of the captured plane. The moonlight through the hangar's skylight turned the aluminum skin into a sheet of liquid mercury. Shimada was holding a small, black crackle box, the remote tuning unit for the Mustang's VHF radio. "I spent 2 hours today listening to the American frequencies," Shimada said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Our interceptors were trying to engage a formation of B-29s over Shizuoka. I heard the Mustang pilots talking." He looked at Kuroe, his eyes dark with a realization that went beyond military defeat. "They were laughing, Major. They weren't screaming or chanting. One of them was telling a joke about a girl in a place called Kansas. Another was complaining that his coffee in the thermos was getting cold. They were 4 miles above the earth, in the middle of a battle that is destroying our civilization, and they were bored. They were discussing their breakfast." Kuroe leaned against the fuselage. He understood. The Mustang had removed the struggle from the war. For the Japanese, every flight was a desperate, spiritual battle against gravity, failing machinery, and superior numbers. For the Americans, the Mustang had turned the war into a professional commute. It was a job performed with high-octane fuel and comfortable seats. "The radio is the worst part," Shimada continued, tapping the black box. "It makes them a single organism. They are not 600 individual pilots. They are a 1,000-headed beast that shares one mind. If one sees a Hayate in the clouds, every other pilot knows its position within 3 seconds. We are fighting ghosts who can whisper to each other across the sky." Suddenly, the air raid sirens began to wail, a long, rising and falling shriek that tore through the stillness of Fussa. The ground shook as the heavy anti-aircraft batteries on the perimeter began to thump, their rhythmic vibrations rattling the tools on the workbenches. Kuroe and Shimada stepped out of the hangar. High above, carved out by the cold light of the moon, were the silhouettes of the B-29 superfortresses. But they weren't alone. Hovering around them like silver guardian angels were the slender, unmistakable shapes of the Mustangs. For the first time in the war, the American fighters were there, 700 miles from their nearest base. They were circling Tokyo with the casual ease of hawks over a farmyard. The impossible had become a nightly reality. "Look at them," Kuroe whispered, his heart heavy with a profound sense of historical justice. "They traveled 1,500 miles over the open ocean just to watch us burn. They don't even need to fire a shot tonight. Their presence alone is the victory." In the distance, the first incendiary bombs began to fall, turning the horizon into a jagged line of orange fire. The captured Mustang in the hangar behind them seemed to pulse with the reflection of the flames, a silver demon finally reunited with its brothers in the sky. The decision to fuel the captured P-51 for a combat mission was not born of strategic logic, but of a dark, poetic desperation. As the fires of Tokyo lit the eastern horizon with a sickly, bruised purple glow, the High Command issued a secret directive. Major Kuroe was to shadow a night raid, not to engage in a mass dogfight, but to hunt, to see, with the eyes of the enemy, how the end would arrive. The mechanics worked in a feverish, mechanical trance. They poured the precious, scavenged 100-octane American fuel into the wing tanks, the liquid smelling of a distant, superior world. They checked the 6 Browning machine guns, loading them with captured belts of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Each brass casing clicked into the feed tray with a sound like a closing coffin lid. "Major," Professor Okada whispered as Kuroe climbed into the cockpit. The old engineer looked as though he had aged a decade in a single night. "Be careful. This machine is faster than your instincts. It will not forgive a Japanese mistake." Kuroe nodded, sliding the teardrop canopy shut. The hiss of the seal was absolute. He was now alone in a pressurized silver womb. He taxied out into the darkness, the blue flames from the exhaust stacks flickering like ghostly fingers against the hangar walls. The takeoff was a surge of raw, unadulterated power. Without the drag of external tanks, the Mustang leapt from the runway of Fussa, climbing at a rate that made Kuroe's head swim. By the time he reached 20,000 feet, the scale of the catastrophe was visible. Tokyo was a glowing bed of coals, a jagged map of fire carved by the B-29 squadrons. Then he saw them. High above the burning capital, silhouetted against the rising moon, were the Mustangs of the 21st Fighter Group. They were orbiting the inferno, their silver bellies catching the orange glare from below. They looked like predatory fish circling a dying whale. Kuroe merged with the darkness, staying 1,000 feet below the American formation. Through his K-14 gun sight, he tracked a lone P-51 that had drifted slightly from its element. The gyro-stabilized reticle hummed, a soft electronic vibration that felt like a heartbeat in the control stick. For a fleeting second, Kuroe had the kill in his sights. He could have pressed the trigger. He could have sent 6,000 rounds of lead into the unsuspecting American. He could have claimed a victory for the Emperor. But he didn't. He stayed his hand, mesmerized by the sheer ease of the pursuit. In his Hayate, this intercept would have been a frantic struggle against engine torque and failing visibility. Here he was gliding on a cushion of engineering perfection. He realized that to kill this pilot would change nothing. It would be like throwing a pebble at a tidal wave. Suddenly, the American pilot, a boy from a land of wheat fields and neon lights, banked his wing. For a brief moment, their canopies were parallel. Kuroe saw the faint glow of the American's instrument panel reflecting off his oxygen mask. The American waved, a casual, bored gesture to his wingman, unaware that a ghost was flying inches from his life. Kuroe pulled the Mustang into a steep, split-S dive, plunging back toward the darkness of the Japanese countryside. He had seen enough. When he landed back at Fussa, the ground crews ran to the plane, expecting news of a victory. Kuroe climbed out, his face pale and his eyes distant. He walked past the officers, past the waiting cameras, and stood by the tail of the silver fighter. "Major!" Captain Shimada called out. "Did you engage? Did you find the weakness?" Kuroe looked at his hands, which were steady for the first time in months. "There is no weakness, Shimada," Kuroe said, his voice echoing in the hollow hangar. "I flew among them. I saw their faces. They aren't fighting a war. They are merely presiding over an execution. This machine, it doesn't belong to us. And neither does the sky." That night, Kuroe did not sleep. He sat in the ready room, writing a letter to his family that he knew would never be delivered. He wrote about the silver wings that had replaced the sun and the sound of a Merlin engine that sounded like the ticking of a final cosmic clock. May of 1945 brought no spring renewal to Fussa, only the persistent scent of scorched earth and a suffocating sense of the end. The American raids had become a daily clockwork, and the sky over Japan no longer belonged to the divine wind, but to endless swarms of silver machines. The captured Mustang in Hangar Number 3 was no longer a secret. It had become a monument. In the early morning, while the mist still clung to the tops of the ancient cryptomeria trees, a colonel from the general staff entered the hangar. His uniform was rumpled, and his eyes held a hollow, glassy stare. He did not look at the aircraft. He looked only at Major Kuroe, who was meticulously wiping the condensation from the Mustang's plexiglass canopy. "Major," the colonel's voice was as dry as the snap of a dead branch. "Orders have arrived from Tokyo. Sector 5 is to be abandoned within 48 hours. All captured enemy equipment that cannot be evacuated must be destroyed." Kuroe froze. The rag in his hand stopped mid-motion. "Destroyed?" he repeated, though he had heard perfectly. "Colonel, this aircraft is the singular achievement of this century's engineering. We have only just begun to comprehend its control systems and its supercharger." "We no longer need to understand how it works, Kuroe," the colonel snapped. "We only need to ensure the Americans do not find it in flying condition. Assign a team of technicians, drain the remaining fuel, seize the documentation, and burn it. This is a direct command." When the colonel departed, a silence descended upon the hangar, broken only by the heavy breathing of Professor Okada, who had overheard the exchange from behind the landing gear strut. The old engineer stepped into the light, his face as pale as a burial shroud. "To burn it," Okada whispered, staring at the flawless engine cowlings. "It is the same as burning a library or a temple. They do not realize they are destroying a textbook of the future, not just a weapon." Kuroe did not answer immediately. He walked to the tail section where the serial number, 443,897, was still visible. 500 pounds of high-octane gasoline remained in the tanks, enough for one brief, final flight. "We will not burn it," Kuroe said suddenly. His voice had found a strange, almost liturgical depth. At least, not on the ground. Ishida and Okada looked at him with a bewilderment that quickly shifted into understanding. There was no rebellion in the Major's eyes, only the melancholy of a man who had decided to close a chapter of history on his own terms. "Prepare the machine for flight," Kuroe commanded. "One last time. I will take it into the air when the Americans arrive. If this machine is destined to die, it will die in its own element. Like a warrior, not like a heap of scrap metal in a bonfire." The technicians, who usually followed regulations without question, worked this time with a frantic, desperate tenderness. They checked the hydraulic pressure one last time, tightened the locking bolts, and polished the propeller blades. It was a funeral, and each of them wanted the deceased to look magnificent. At dawn the following day, the sky over Fussa was bruised with a dark, ominous crimson. The radar stations reported a formation of 30 fighters approaching at low altitude. They were the real Mustangs, coming to sweep the path for the heavy bombers. Kuroe buckled his parachute straps and pulled on his flight helmet. He took no ammunition. The belts and the machine guns were empty. He did not intend to kill. He intended only to say goodbye. The roar of the Packard Merlin was the only sound in the world as Major Kuroe leveled the Mustang at 3,000 feet. Below him, the Fussa airfield was a frantic hive of smoke and retreating shadows. The anti-aircraft batteries had fallen silent, their crews either dead or huddled in slit trenches, watching the silver ghost climb into the morning mist. Kuroe felt a strange, cold peace. For the first time, he wasn't flying for an emperor or a fading empire. He was flying for the sheer, terrifying beauty of the machine. "Here they come," he whispered into his oxygen mask. From the east, a flight of 4 P-51s appeared, their polished wings cutting through the clouds like razors. They were the blue-nosed bastards of Bodney, their cowlings painted a defiant, bright azure. They spotted the lone Mustang and instinctively began to spread out into a finger-4 formation, preparing for a kill. Kuroe did not dive, he did not run. He banked the captured fighter into a steep, graceful turn, showing them his silhouette. He saw the lead American pilot hesitate. The confusion was visible even from a distance. A Mustang with the Hinomaru, the red sun of Japan, painted on its wings was an impossibility, a hallucination of the war's end. The Americans closed in. Kuroe watched them through the rearview mirror. He could see the gun ports of the lead fighter blinking, short, ranging bursts that streaked past his canopy like tracers of light. Instead of fighting back, Kuroe performed a maneuver he had perfected in the Mustang during his weeks of testing. He pulled the stick back and kicked the rudder, sending the silver fighter into a violent, high-speed barrel roll that shed speed instantly. The lead American, caught off guard by the sudden deceleration, flashed past Kuroe's wing, less than 20 feet away. For a heartbeat, Kuroe looked directly into the eyes of the American pilot. The boy looked no older than 20, his face hidden behind a rubber mask, his eyes wide with shock. Kuroe offered a crisp, formal salute, the salute of a samurai to a worthy foe. Then, Kuroe pushed the nose down. He wasn't aiming for the Americans, he was aiming for the sacred peak of Mount Fuji, which stood indifferent and majestic against the horizon. "It is time, Professor," Kuroe muttered, thinking of the old man in the hangar. He reached down and toggled the emergency fuel release. The high-octane gasoline began to vent from the wing tanks, creating a long, white plume of vapor behind him. He then flipped the master ignition switch to off and back to on. The backfire was instantaneous. A brilliant orange flame erupted from the exhaust stacks, igniting the fuel vapor. In a split second, the silver Mustang was transformed into a streak of fire, a falling star over the heart of Japan. The American pilots watched in silence as the burning fighter plunged toward the forest at the base of the mountain. There was no explosion, only a soft, distant thud as the metal disintegrated against the ancient pines. Back at Fussa, Professor Okada and Captain Shimada stood on the tarmac, watching the thin spiral of black smoke rise in the distance. The sirens had stopped. The sky was now filled with hundreds of B-29s, their shadows crossing the earth like a shroud. "He gave it back to the wind," Shimada said, his voice thick with the melancholy that no words could describe. "No," Okada replied, taking off his spectacles and wiping them with a trembling hand. "He gave it back to the future. We were never meant to hold it. We were only meant to see it, so we would know exactly what we have lost." The age of the sword was over. The age of the machine had arrived. And as the sun rose over the ruins of the empire, the silver wings of the Mustang continued to circle, high and cold, marking the first day of a world that no longer had room for ghosts.